If you've ever watched any behind-the-scenes footage of films or video games, you've probably seen them use motion capture, using computers and technology to track the movement of actors. You may even wonder why motion capture hasn't replaced animation entirely. Why would studios spend so much time and money to have people animate everything by hand when they could just put a guy in a suit and track his movements? Well, studios did try that, and we'll get to that in a moment. But like most things in animation, it's not quite that simple. In this day and age, motion capture is actually its own entirely separate career path in animation, and a wonderfully fulfilling and creative one at that. It's used in film VFX, streaming avatars, live performances, and video game animation. In fact, game animation is one of its most powerful use cases. Take Baldur's Gate 3 for example. Nearly 200 hours of dialogue with full body motion capture for almost every single line. This would be an astronomical task to animate, both labor and expense-wise, but adds an incredible layer of depth to the performances in-game that wouldn't be possible otherwise. But you can't just put someone in a motion capture suit, record their performance, and drop it into the game engine. Someone needs to clean that motion capture up, exaggerating movements, tightening poses, and adding hand and facial animation on top. This is a skill in itself, not to mention those responsible for managing and organizing the pipeline to make this possible. Even when cleanup isn't possible though, motion capture for live performances have seen incredible developments in the past decade. Facial tracking is one thing, but capturing the entire body and mapping it to a virtual character in real time has a near infinite amount of creative possibilities. But it wasn't always this way. Motion capture had been used here and there in the industry for quite some time since the 90s, to varying degrees of success, but it wasn't until the turn of the century when mocap was being used everywhere. The success of motion capture in live-action VFX quickly led to the idea of using it for entire animated films, with the biggest success coming from image movers. Even though none of these films were as successful as other animated films of the time, the potential for motion capture to completely disrupt the animation industry was there, and studio executives noticed. When Disney partnered with Image Movers to create Image Movers Digital and produce even more fully motion capture animated films, it felt like motion capture was slowly replacing handmade animation, rather than being used as a tool alongside animators. You can feel the annoyance and anxiety this caused in the animation industry boiled down in this short film created at CalArts, featuring the likes of James Baxter and a young Alex Hirsch. I recommend watching the whole thing linked in the description below because it's hilarious. But mostly I just want to show how animators at the time were really not happy with motion capture being abused by studios in an attempt to replace animators, just because it was the newest technology. And the silliest part is that motion capture back then required expensive suits, cameras, actors, and gigantic stages, and required cleanup from animators anyways. So studios were often spending more money for a worse result. Now, I'm not saying motion capture is inherently worse than hand-keyed animation. It makes perfect sense if you want to capture complex motion like dancing, or detailed and nuanced performances for realistic animation. That's what it's built to do. When used as a tool in the right places, it can add to the experience. But trying to use it for everything is like trying to build a house out of hammers. If it's used where it's not needed, it can actually detract from the experience. Monster House, for example, is a great film that I think a lot of people, including me, look back on pretty fondly. But isn't using motion capture the literal antithesis to the film's claymation aesthetic? Can you imagine how much better this film would have been if it was actually animated like a stop-motion film? I don't really seem to be alone in this either, considering most reviews of the film I've read mention how lackluster the animation is, and that's almost entirely due to the use or misuse of motion capture. Was it worth it for a result that looks worse than other animated films of the same time period? Considering Image Movers Digital shut down just a few years later and there hasn't really been a major film release animated entirely with motion capture since then, probably not. But that's because we learned the best way to apply motion capture as a tool and not a replacement. And over time, the technology became astronomically cheaper and more accessible, to the point where anyone can get a suit and capture performances in their own home, including me, right now. What do you think? Do you like it? This is a live performance with just barely any cleanup on top, done using the Rococo Smart Suit and gloves, which I'll talk about later. The best way I can describe how this looks in terms of animation is like a mascot costume. The animation looks and feels like I'm wearing a costume underneath, because I am. But if animation is all about convincingly recreating movement from real life, why does it look weird? Chuck Jones was once interviewed in the 1970s about realistic animation, and he described Roger from 101 Dalmatians as looking more human than humans do. He believed that even realistic animation should look like Roger's because animation should exaggerate real life, rather than just imitate it. But motion capture doesn't exaggerate. My proportions are heavily stylized and exaggerated, but my animation is more muted and understated. There's a disconnect between the two that makes things feel off. This is what was missing in Monster House's animation. The animation was fine, but that's all it is. It's not more human than human in any way. It's just human. It doesn't fit the claymation-like visuals, which are exaggerated. And just so we're clear, when I say exaggerated, I don't mean I want their eyes popping out of their head like Looney Tunes. What I mean is that it feels floaty and stiff. It's not exaggerated in a way that emphasizes good timing and key poses like hand-keyed animation would. Motion capture creates highly detailed animation that works great for human characters, but tends to feel distracting and awkward for cartoony characters because they aren't proportioned like human characters. There's that disconnect, hence why this feels weird. And it's also why modern CGI creatures like Rocket Raccoon are not motion captured. He's not proportioned like a human, he's proportioned like a raccoon. So he's animated entirely by hand. They have actors on set for reference and eye lines, but none of that data gets used. He's just there to help actors act, and the footage later helps animators animate. However, that doesn't mean cartoon characters with mascot-like movement have no value. After all, everyone loves mascot costumes, including me. Here's me meeting Shrek at Universal and his big rubber hands weighing down on my head. In fact, when I told you that I'm literally capturing this movement myself in real time and showed you what that looked like, you probably thought it looked fun. There's a talent to performing, and a delight from seeing a larger-than-life character move and interact with people. Where that tends to fall apart, in my opinion, is when you record it by itself with nothing else, and then try to say it's equivalent to a movie or a TV show. We know it's a costume character, yet it's being sold the same as everything else in that medium. Not to say costume characters don't work in film or TV, obviously there's fantastic and famous examples of excellent costumes and puppetry in all mediums. What I mean is, studios were practically taking the guy in the Shrek costume and saying that's Shrek 5. Obviously that's not going to work. You could use motion capture as a starting point for animators and then clean it up so it looks good enough for film, but at that point you'd probably have a better result for the same price by just hiring an animator. But it's also exactly why mocap works in a live performance. It's fun to see people perform as characters, because the expectations are more straightforward. We obviously don't hold live performances to the same standard as film, and the digital costume allows for way more creative possibilities than a real-life costume ever could, as evidenced by everything the VTuber community has been doing for the past decade. It's the digital equivalent of a mascot costume, or a professional wrestler persona. Obviously people know it's a character, but that doesn't mean the audience can't play along with the kayfabe. And as motion capture gets cheaper and more accessible, we now arrive at the point where anyone can do motion capture right at their own home, which is what I've been doing this whole time. So let's talk about that. I'm using the Rokoko Smart Suit Pro 2, the smart gloves, and the head rig, which were all sent to me by Rokoko for free alongside the Coil Pro, which I'll talk about in a moment. Even though they sent all this to me for free, I'm not required to say anything specific, positive or negative, so consider this a mini review. Just keep in mind this is all prosumer tech, so it's cheaper than paying entire studios and actors for mocap, but still expensive for most people, and I got it for free, so that's naturally going to influence my opinion a bit. The smart suit is light, fits well, and is pretty comfortable. It's really easy to set up in Rokoko's software and super accurate, and considering you don't need any external cameras or devices to get a full performance, it's pretty impressive. Compared to motion capture of yesteryear, which required entire studios full of capture devices and suits covered in markers, it's pretty nuts to have it all live in the suit. My only complaint is that it requires an external battery bank to power, which wasn't super clear up front. For a bundle advertised as full motion capture, there should probably be a battery not included label near the buy button. But there is a pocket for the battery, so at least the battery can live inside the suit. The smart gloves are also a great fit and are very comfortable. They're obviously a little overkill for Doodly since he has orb hands, but if you want to know how accurate they can be, check this out. Ooh, fingers. You need to have the smart gloves connected to the smart suit to track your hand's position and rotation, but if you don't want to wear the full suit, you can get the Coil Pro instead. The smart gloves combined with the Coil Pro and facial tracking with the head rig allow for waist-up motion capture without a suit, which makes sense for VTubers. However, I'm not convinced it's the best setup for everybody. The gloves are a little too bulky to play video games with or use a keyboard. and the Coil Pro is pretty pricey at $2,000. In my opinion, Rococo's tech is probably overkill for VTubers and artists working alone like me. Getting in and out of the suit, gloves, and head rig to stream or record a video is a lot to ask for when an iPhone and an Ultraleap is all you need for a VTuber setup. However, for indie developers and small studios, Rococo's solution to motion capture is super simple and way cheaper compared to professional motion capture. We're talking a couple grand for everything I used right at home, versus tens of thousands of dollars for professional mocap in a studio. Frankly, I couldn't be more happy with how accessible and cheap motion capture is these days, and how well it integrated into the industry as a tool. But in order to get there, it had to go through a cycle of executives attempting to replace everything with it, and then finding out why that's a bad idea. That actually sounds kind of familiar. Oh no. Okay, I'm not going to spend too much time here, but I can't help but see the similarities between the early adoption of motion capture in the 2000s and now the early adoption of AI. How studios and executives see it as the future of everything and replace the work of humans with it, despite the massive costs and low quality. Setting aside the massive plagiarism and ethics issues with AI here, this is what it boils down to for me. Audiences can tell when something lacks a soul. They were able to tell when motion capture tried to replace hand-keyed animation, and as much as studios want you to believe this isn't the case, yes, they can tell with AI, and they don't like it. Yet, studios try to replace humans with it anyways. They see cost savings that don't exist once you actually dig deeper, and they think audiences won't be able to tell the difference. This isn't to say that AI is going to integrate into the entertainment industry and become a career path like motion capture did. I have no idea what's going to happen with AI, except that it's currently being integrated in the dumbest way possible by having it draw for you, which isn't useful to any artist. I wouldn't wish a career doing that on my worst enemy. But that's not the point of this video. What I'm really trying to say is that we've been here before. The entertainment industry is going through it for a lot of reasons, AI just being one of them. But back in the early 2000s, a lot of animators were out of a job because people thought motion capture was going to replace everything. You saw that short film from CalArts. People were terrified of motion capture. Studios poured money into it as the next big technology, and then audiences realized they didn't want it. Then animators found work again, technology improved, and integrated itself in ways that were actually useful to artists, and animation has never been in a better place since until very recently. I'm a fairly optimistic guy, so maybe this is a rose-tinted way of seeing things, but what I hope your takeaway from this video is, motion capture didn't replace animation, and AI won't replace it either. Thanks for watching.